Hey guys, tonight we walk together through a world that feels like it has just exhaled after holding its breath for years. You are standing in a field that should be busy, but instead it's quiet enough that you can hear insects working overtime. The Black Death has finally loosened its grip, and you're still here, which already puts you in a very exclusive club. You look around and realize, with a calm little shiver, that you probably won't survive this either, statistically speaking. But for now, you're awake, breathing, and curious. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what the local time is. It's oddly comforting knowing someone else is awake somewhere. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take your first slow steps into the aftermath. Church bells ring, but not constantly anymore. That alone feels strange. During the height of the plague, bells rang so often they blurred into background noise, like an annoying notification you couldn't turn off. Now each bell stands alone in the air, marking a death, yes, but also marking survival. Mainstream historians agree that by the time the first great wave of the Black Death recedes around the early 1350s, between a third and half of Europe's population is gone. You don't need a ledger to feel that truth. You see it in the empty cottages, the fields half-tilled, the roads where grass is already pushing through wagon ruts. You wander past farmland that hasn't been touched in seasons. The soil is dark, rich, and frankly a little offended that no one has shown up to use it. Sheep graze where wheat once grew, doing what sheep do best, looking judgmental while contributing almost nothing. There's a strange calm to it all, like nature shrugged and said, "Fine, I'll take it from here." A quirky tidbit drifts into your mind. In some regions, wolves and wild boar move closer to villagers during these years, emboldened by the lack of humans. Medieval people notice. They write about it. They do not enjoy it. You step into a village that technically still exists, though exists is doing a lot of work here. Doors hang open. Inside one house, a cup still sits on a table, as if someone just stepped out and forgot to come back. That detail sticks with you because it feels too modern, too relatable. Historians still argue whether many of these homes were abandoned suddenly or gradually, but standing here, it feels abrupt, like the world hit pause and never quite pressed play again. The silence is what really gets you. Medieval life was loud, animals, people, tools, complaints. Now, even your own footsteps sound intrusive. You become hyper-aware of your breathing, which is not ideal bedtime content, but stay with me. You realize that the end of the plague doesn't come with fireworks or a grand announcement. It just fades. Death visits less often. The sick recover more frequently. And one day, someone notices that the gravedigger hasn't been busy in a while. You pass a churchyard where fresh graves thin out into older ones. Grass grows unevenly, and in one corner, the earth still looks tired. Clergy records from the period show that many parishes lost multiple priests in quick succession, leaving gaps not just in leadership, but in memory. Who was buried where? Who received last rites? You sense a collective shrug forming. Survival takes priority over perfect record keeping. A light joke slips in as you notice a rooster crowing in the distance, confidently announcing a dawn no one asked him about. He's very proud of himself. Life, it turns out, is extremely eager to continue. You feel that eagerness in your own chest mixed with guilt. Why you? That question hangs in the air everywhere you go. Some people whisper that God spared them for a reason. Others quietly avoid eye contact with that thought entirely. You overhear conversations, murmured, cautious. People talk about who's missing more than who's left. Names become shorthand for absence. Since Thomas, someone says, and you know exactly what they mean. Time itself is now measured in loss. There's a mainstream historical consensus that this period triggers a profound psychological shift. Even if medieval people don't have the language for trauma, you can feel it anyway. Everyone walks a little slower, like the ground might open up again if rushed. Near the edge of town, you spot a boundary marker half swallowed by weeds. Property lines matter, but right now, there's more land than people to argue over it. That will change, but not yet. For now, the landscape feels temporarily generous. A fringe detail floats by. Some surviving peasants reportedly believed the land itself had been cleansed by death, making crops healthier. It's probably coincidence, but better harvests do follow in many areas, helped by less strain on resources. You pause and listen again. No carts, no shouting merchants, just wind, birds, and that rooster who's still going. The absence feels heavy but also spacious. You realize this is the moment between disasters and decisions. Society hasn't reorganized yet. Rules still exist on paper, but reality hasn't checked the paperwork. Historians still argue whether people immediately recognized how much power this absence gave them, or whether it crept in slowly, like realizing your alarm didn't go off but you're already awake. As night approaches, smoke rises from fewer chimneys than before. Each one feels important now, like a tiny declaration of persistence. You feel a strange tenderness toward these lights. They're fragile, but stubborn. You imagine future generations trying to understand this quiet and failing, because silence doesn't leave ruins the way castles do. You settle into that thought, letting it soften. The plague has ended, but the world hasn't restarted yet. You're standing in the hush between chapters, where everything that comes next is possible but not inevitable. And as you breathe in the cool air, you let the silence carry you a little further toward rest. You keep moving, because standing still in a half-empty world makes your thoughts louder than you'd like. The silence from before doesn't disappear, but it thins as you approach places where people have cautiously regrouped. This is the phase where everyone starts counting, quietly, obsessively, who's left. Not in a neat census way, more like mental arithmetic done while pretending not to stare. Mainstream history tells you that formal population counts won't become common for centuries, but informal tallies absolutely happen now. You see it in the way neighbors scan doorways, nod slowly, and mentally tick off names that still answer. You enter a village green where a few survivors have gathered, keeping a respectful distance from one another, like they're not entirely convinced proximity is safe again. Someone is reading names from a parchment, and each name lands with a soft thud in the air. Not dramatic, just factual. This is who remains. This is who inherits. You realize survival isn't just emotional now, it's legal. If your cousin didn't make it, his tools might be yours. If an entire family line ends, their land doesn't just vanish. It becomes a problem to solve. You watch elders debate who has the right to what. Medieval inheritance laws suddenly matter to people who never cared about them before. Under feudal custom, land often reverts to a lord if there's no clear heir, and lords are very aware of this fact. Historians agree that this post-plague period sees a surge in property disputes, not because people suddenly became greedy, but because ambiguity exploded overnight. You feel the tension in the air, like everyone's walking on a floor made of fragile agreements. A quirky detail sneaks in as you notice someone arguing over a chicken coop with the seriousness of a royal succession crisis. The coop leans. The chicken looks unimpressed. This is what survival looks like: petty, necessary, and deeply human. Some communities create entirely new rules on the fly, favoring whoever is physically present over distant legal heirs. Historians still argue whether these informal practices permanently weakened feudal legal norms or merely bent them for a generation. You drift toward the church again, because records live there, or at least they're supposed to. Inside, parchments are stacked unevenly. Ink smudges. Margins are filled with hurried notes like "dead" or "gone," which are not very precise but get the point across. Clerks struggle to keep up, and sometimes they just stop trying. One mainstream fact stands out: many parish registers from this era show gaps or sudden changes in handwriting, reflecting how many record keepers died and were replaced by whoever could write at all. You overhear a conversation about belonging. A woman whose entire household survived feels strangely isolated because everyone around her didn't. A man whose family is gone feels untethered, unsure where he fits now. Belonging used to be inherited, now it's negotiated. There's a fringe belief circulating that plague survivors are somehow marked, either favored by God or quietly cursed. Neither theory is especially comforting, but both explain the unease when people look at you just a second too long. You notice how age matters differently now. Children are rare, elders rarer. Middle-aged adults suddenly form the backbone of everything. People in their 30s carry authority they didn't ask for. Historians still argue whether this demographic shift accelerated social change or simply intensified existing pressures. But standing here, you feel the weight settle unevenly on certain shoulders. There's a small meeting near a boundary stone where villagers debate who counts as all one of us. A family that fled during the worst months wants to return. Another family says they forfeited that right by leaving. This debate isn't abstract, it determines who eats. You sense that community, once defined by tradition, is now being rewritten in real time. A light joke drifts through your thoughts as you imagine medieval group chats full of passive, aggressive messages about who abandoned whom. Property lines are walked, measured by steps and memory. Someone swears a tree marked the edge of a field, but the tree is gone. Was it cut down, or did it die like everything else? No one remembers clearly. This confusion benefits some and ruins others. You realize that survival creates winners even when no one feels victorious. As dusk falls, lists are rolled up and tucked away. The counting doesn't end, it just pauses until tomorrow. You feel how exhausting it is to exist in a world where nothing can be assumed. Not who owns what, not who belongs, not even how many of you there are. And yet, beneath the tension, there's a fragile relief. You are being counted because you are here. You carry that thought with you as night settles again. The living are fewer, but they are present, negotiating their way forward, one name, one plot of land, one quiet agreement at a time. The world hasn't healed, but it has started keeping score, and for now you're still on the list. You wake to the sound of work that actually matters again. It's faint but unmistakable. The scrape of a hoe against soil, the clack of wood being repaired, the low murmur of people realizing they are needed. After all that counting, something shifts. You feel it in your posture before you even name it. Labor, once abundant and cheap, is suddenly rare, and rare things get noticed. You walk toward a field where a handful of workers are doing the job that once took dozens. They move steadily, not frantically, because for the first time in their lives, no one is rushing them. Mainstream historians agree on this point. The drastic population loss from the Black Death creates a labor shortage across Europe. Fields need tending, roads need repairing, homes need rebuilding, and there simply aren't enough hands. You are one of those hands now, and people know it. A landholder approaches you, polite in a way that feels new. He asks, not orders. It's subtle, but your body registers it immediately. You can say no. You've never really been able to say no before. This is where the power shift begins, not with speeches or revolts, but with raised eyebrows and unspoken leverage. Historians still argue whether peasants consciously recognized this as a turning point, or whether it just felt like common sense responding to scarcity. You overhear workers comparing offers. Offers. That word alone would have sounded ridiculous a decade ago. One village promises better bread, another offers lighter duties. Someone mentions actual coin instead of vague future favors. You almost laugh, then remember laughing too loudly still feels risky. A light joke slips through your thoughts anyway. It's the medieval version of scrolling job listings while pretending not to care. A quirky tidbit floats in. In some regions, laborers deliberately move from manor to manor, ignoring traditional obligations, just to test how far they can push. This wandering workforce becomes such a headache that chroniclers complain about idle people who are, in reality, very actively shopping for better conditions. From your perspective, it doesn't feel idle at all. It feels like leverage stretching its legs. You notice how this changes conversations. Lords and officials speak more carefully. They still have authority, but it's dented, like armor that's taken a hit and can't be unseen. You sense irritation beneath their calm. They didn't plan for this. No one did. The social hierarchy was built on assumptions of endless labor, and now the math doesn't work. Food tastes better lately, not because it's seasoned differently, but because you're eating more of it. Fewer mouths mean more calories per person, and you feel stronger. Mainstream accounts from the period note improvements in average diet among survivors, especially access to meat and dairy. Your body thanks you for this, even as your mind tries not to connect it directly to absence. There's debate, even now, about whether this improved standard of living is widespread or patchy. Historians still argue whether rural laborers benefit more than urban workers, but standing here with full stomach and negotiating power, the change feels real enough. You stretch in the morning without dread. That's new. You watch a small group refuse work outright, and the sky doesn't fall. No punishment, no immediate consequences, just awkward silence and a promise to talk later. That silence is louder than any shout. It tells you the rules are bending, not broken, but flexing in ways they never have before. As evening comes, you rest without being chased by exhaustion. You realize that for the first time, your labor is not invisible. It is noticed, bargained for, even respected in a begrudging way. The world still feels fragile, but you're no longer just surviving it. You're shaping it with every yes and no, every step you take toward or away from the fields. And as sleep pulls at you, there's a quiet, dangerous comfort in knowing that your hands matter now. And that knowledge, once learned, doesn't easily fade. You don't need a proclamation nailed to a door to know something's wrong, at least wrong from the perspective of people who like things predictable. You feel it in the way officials clear their throats before speaking, in how messengers arrive more often, carrying folded parchment and a sense of urgency. Wages are rising, and not gently. They're jumping, skipping, sometimes sprinting ahead of expectations. For you, this feels practical. For those in charge, it feels like panic with ink on it. You hear about it first through rumor. A reeve complains that workers are demanding double pay. A merchant mutters that apprentices want terms instead of obedience. Mainstream historians agree that across much of Europe, especially England and parts of France, wages climb sharply in the decades after the Black Death because labor is scarce and work is plentiful. From where you stand, it just feels like finally being able to ask for what makes sense. Then come the reactions. Governments do not enjoy surprise economic shifts, especially ones that empower people who don't usually get empowered. You hear about new laws read aloud in market squares, delivered with the stern tone of someone trying to sound taller than they feel. These statutes insist that wages must return to customary levels, which is a polite way of saying, please forget what you just learned about your own value. You stand in a crowd as one such law is announced. The words wash over you: limits on pay, restrictions on movement, penalties for refusal to work. In England, this becomes the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, followed by the Statute of Labourers in 1351, a mainstream historical fact that makes scholars nod solemnly. In the moment, though, it sounds like a badly timed joke. A light one slips into your thoughts. It's like being told you can't check prices online anymore because ignorance was more convenient. You notice how people react. Some nod obediently. Others stare at the ground, already planning to ignore it. Enforcement is spotty, because the same shortage that raised wages also limits who can enforce laws. The irony is delicious if you're tired enough to enjoy irony. Officials threaten fines, but who will collect them? Who will replace you if you leave? A quirky tidbit surfaces in some areas. Workers intentionally accept illegal wages just out of sight, then publicly swear they're earning less. It's medieval. Don't ask, don't tell, complete with plausible deniability and suspiciously well-fed laborers. Historians still argue whether these laws meaningfully slowed wage growth or mostly served as symbolic reassurance for anxious elites. You feel the tension sharpen when tempers flare. Lords accuse workers of greed. Workers quietly accuse lords of hypocrisy. After all, prices haven't frozen, rents haven't dropped. Only wages are supposed to stand still like obedient statues. You sense the imbalance immediately, even if no one uses the word fair out loud. Conversations change tone. Requests become negotiations. Negotiations become standoffs. You hear about people being fined for excessive pay, but the fines vary wildly, depending on who's watching and who's needed. Justice, it turns out, is flexible when everyone's tired. Another light joke drifts by as you imagine medieval spreadsheets trying and failing to keep up. At night, you replay the announcements in your head. You understand the fear behind them. A system built on predictability is wobbling. If wages rise too fast, old obligations unravel. But you also feel something steadier underneath, the sense that once you know your worth, you can't unknow it. Historians still argue whether this period marks the true beginning of the end for rigid feudal labor systems. But standing here, you feel the cracks spreading. You watch some people comply out of caution. Others leave entirely, slipping away to places where laws are harder to enforce and hands are even scarcer. The road becomes an option again, not just an escape. That alone changes how trapped you feel. As days pass, the laws remain posted, read, repeated. But reality keeps doing its own thing. Wages don't fall neatly back into place. They hover, dip, rise again. It's messy, human, and exhausting. You sense that the old order is trying to reassert itself, but it's doing so with tired arms and borrowed authority. By the time you settle to rest, you realize this isn't a battle anyone wins quickly. It's a tug of war stretched across decades with parchment on one side and empty fields on the other. And as sleep pulls you under, you know which side has the heavier pull, no matter how loudly the laws are read. You start to notice the strain from the other side now, because power always creaks loudest when you lean on it. You walk past manor houses that still stand tall but feel oddly hollow, like grand shells left behind by something that moved out in a hurry. Lords remain lords, technically, but something essential is missing. Tenants, rents, certainty. You can almost hear the echo of unanswered expectations bouncing off stone walls. You meet a noble standing at the edge of his land, staring across fields that should be full of activity and aren't. He's calculating, not harvesting. Mainstream historians agree that landowners across Europe face a crisis after the Black Death. Estates designed for dense populations suddenly produce less income because there simply aren't enough people to work them. Feudal obligations assumed a constant supply of labor, and now that assumption looks optimistic. You sense the desperation beneath the silk and titles. Some lords try to hold on, clinging tightly to traditional dues and services, insisting the old rules still apply. Others adapt, grudgingly offering incentives, shorter service, lighter rents, even wages, to keep land from going wild. Historians still argue whether flexibility or stubbornness was the more successful strategy, but from your vantage point, stubbornness mostly looks lonely. A quirky tidbit drifts by as you hear of nobles advertising for tenants far beyond their usual domains, offering surprisingly generous terms. It's the medieval equivalent of move in specials, minus the free month's rent and plus a lot more mud. You imagine banners flapping with invisible slogans. Please farm here, we're nice now. Mostly. You walk through once orderly fields where weeds claim space without asking permission. Sheep wander freely, which is efficient in its own way. Some landowners convert arable land to pasture because sheep require fewer hands. This shift toward wool production is a mainstream historical fact and will ripple outward into trade and industry. For now, it just looks like a quiet admission of defeat. Inside manor courts, tempers flare. Lords complain about ungrateful tenants who demand better terms. Tenants quietly compare offers from neighboring estates. Power, you realize, doesn't disappear, it negotiates. A light joke hums through your thoughts as you imagine medieval landlords discovering that, because I said so, no longer closes the deal. You notice how inheritance complicates everything, with entire noble lines wiped out, titles passed to distant relatives or minors. Regents step in, often more cautious than confident. Records show an increase in legal disputes among the elite themselves, not just between lords and peasants. Survival didn't just thin the bottom of society, it shook the top too. There's an unspoken fear here that if control slips too far, the hierarchy itself might tilt. Lords still hold courts, still command respect, but it's tinged with performance now. Authority needs an audience, and the audience has options. Historians still argue whether this period marks a genuine decline in noble power or merely a temporary recalibration. But standing in these echoing halls, the recalibration feels significant. You see attempts at compromise. Long-term leases replace short obligations. Cash rents replace labor services. These changes aren't driven by ideology, they're driven by necessity. You feel how the system bends around the absence left by death, reshaping itself in quieter ways than rebellion. As evening settles over the estate, lights flicker in fewer windows than before. The grandeur remains, but it's thinner, stretched over less certainty. You realize that the Black Death didn't just remove people, it exposed which structures depended entirely on their presence. And as you drift toward rest, there's a soft understanding that even stone walls feel vulnerable when the land around them is empty. You feel it first as a quiet experiment, like testing ice with the toe of your boot. You take a step that once would have earned a sharp correction, and nothing happens. No shout, no fine, just space. After watching lords struggle and laws wobble, you and people like you begin doing something subtle and powerful. You test new freedoms. You notice peasants negotiating terms that used to be fixed by birth. A day off here, lower rent there, permission to marry without approval. These aren't revolutionary demands shouted from rooftops. They're practical adjustments whispered across fences. Mainstream historians agree that the post-Black Death period sees a gradual erosion of rigid feudal obligations, even if the system doesn't collapse outright. From where you stand, it feels less like rebellion and more like breathing deeper than before. You walk alongside someone who decides to leave their village entirely. Not fleeing, choosing. They've heard there's better land 2 days' walk away. Light adieux, a lord who doesn't ask too many questions. The road, once a symbol of danger and punishment, becomes an option. Historians still argue whether this mobility was widespread or exaggerated by later sources, but you see enough movement to know it's real. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you hear of people changing their names or conveniently forgetting old obligations when they arrive somewhere new. Paper records are thin, memories thinner. Reinvention becomes possible in small, plausible ways. You imagine medieval LinkedIn profiles quietly updating themselves. You sense the tension this creates. Lords accuse peasants of insolence, a word that does a lot of emotional work. Peasants quietly discover that insolence sometimes goes unpunished when alternatives exist. The power isn't equal, but it's no longer one-directional. A light joke drifts through your thoughts as you picture feudalism buffering like a slow, loading page. Daily life reflects the change. You see better clothing on people who once wore only scraps. Not luxury, just dignity. Shoes that fit. Tools that are owned, not borrowed. Mainstream accounts note improved material conditions for many survivors, especially in rural areas. Your body feels it too. Less hunger means clearer thinking. And clearer thinking leads to questions. Those questions stay mostly unspoken, but they're there. Why must I owe this? Why can't that change? Historians still argue whether peasants developed a conscious sense of rights during this period or simply responded to opportunity, but the effect looks the same either way. Boundaries soften. You attend a village gathering where someone openly disagrees with a local official. The disagreement isn't dramatic, but it's public. That's new. No one intervenes. The sky does not fall. You feel a small thrill ripple through the crowd, quickly masked by coughing and shoe scuffing. As night comes, you lie down with the quiet knowledge that some freedoms, once tasted, don't retreat easily. The world hasn't flipped upside down, but it has shifted just enough that you feel it in how you stand, speak, and imagine tomorrow. And that feeling, gentle as it is, carries you toward sleep. You drift back toward the towns now, because even after everything, people still gather where walls promise safety and opportunity. The approach feels different than before the plague. You remember crowds pressed tight, the smells layered thick, the noise constant. Now the gates stand open more often than closed, not out of welcome, but because there's less reason to guard against congestion. Cities refill, but slowly, like a room being warmed after a long winter. As you enter, you notice the gaps first. Entire streets sit quieter than memory says they should. Shops exist without neighbors. Mainstream historians agree that urban populations recover far more slowly than rural ones after the Black Death, partly because cities were hit harder and partly because their survival depends on constant movement and trust. From your perspective, the city feels cautious, like it's not sure whether to fully wake up yet. Trade resumes in fits and starts. A baker opens 3 days a week instead of 7. A market sets up with fewer stalls but surprisingly long conversations. Merchants eye one another carefully, weighing whether demand is real or just hopeful. You overhear someone say, "It's not like before," and no one argues. A light joke drifts through your thoughts as you imagine medieval Yelp reviews reading. Great bread, emotionally distant atmosphere. You walk through a square where new arrivals mingle with long-time survivors. Migration into cities increases during this period, a mainstream historical fact driven by opportunity and rumor. Word spreads that towns need people. Craftsmen, porters, clerks, anyone willing to try. You feel how rumor works faster than official announcements ever could. Hope travels light. Housing becomes an issue almost immediately. Plenty of buildings exist, but not all are livable, and ownership is often unclear. You see families occupying abandoned homes with a mix of gratitude and anxiety, never entirely sure when someone might appear with a claim. Historians still argue whether urban squatting was tacitly tolerated or simply impossible to police, but either way, it reshapes neighborhoods. The sounds of the city change too. Fewer bells, more hammering. Repair replaces replacement. You smell lime and fresh timber instead of rot. That alone feels like progress. A quirky tidbit floats up as you hear that some cities temporarily lower entry fees or citizenship requirements to attract residents, essentially advertising themselves long before marketing becomes a thing. You notice trust rebuilding in small gestures. Coins are handled again without hesitation. Hands brush while exchanging goods. People still flinch at coughing, but less dramatically. Mainstream accounts note that trade networks gradually reconnect, though not always in the same patterns as before. Some routes fade, others strengthen. The map redraws itself quietly. Guild halls open their doors more often now, not because rules have loosened entirely, but because necessity pushes them. Cities need services. They need production. You feel how urgency overrides tradition when survival depends on flexibility. Historians still argue whether cities were engines of change or merely mirrors of rural shifts, but walking these streets, the momentum feels real. There's a nervous energy at dusk. Taverns fill earlier than they used to, as if people are afraid of wasting daylight or opportunity. Laughter sounds sharper, slightly forced, but sincere. You catch yourself smiling at a joke you don't fully hear. It's been a while since laughter felt normal. As night settles, lanterns glow in windows that were dark for years. Not all of them. Enough. The city isn't whole, but it's breathing again. You lie down knowing that these slow refills, people trade noise, are stitching something together, one cautious step at a time. And with that steady, patient rebuilding humming around you, sleep comes a little easier. You don't have to look far to see where the pressure really builds, because skill is a different kind of scarcity. As cities slowly refill, workshops reopen, and inside them, the old rules start to creak. Guilds, those careful gatekeepers of medieval labor, are still standing, still proud, but they're missing people. Masters died, journeymen vanished, apprentices never finished. The neat ladder of advancement now has broken rungs. You step into a workshop where tools hang ready but hands are few. The master glances at you longer than usual, not to judge your pedigree, but your usefulness. Mainstream historians agree that after the Black Death, craft guilds across Europe face labor shortages similar to those in agriculture, forcing them to relax restrictions they once guarded fiercely. From your point of view, it feels like rules quietly stepping aside without admitting defeat. You hear whispers of shortcuts, apprentices finishing early, outsiders admitted without the proper lineage, women and migrants doing work once barred to them. Officially, guild statutes still insist on tradition. Unofficially, everyone knows exceptions are happening. Historians still argue whether these changes represented a lasting weakening of guild power or a temporary adaptation, but standing amid half-finished goods, adaptation feels unavoidable. A quirky tidbit slips in as you learn that some guilds lower entrance fees or waive elaborate initiation rituals simply because they can't afford to turn people away. Imagine an organization built on exclusivity suddenly saying, "Well, explain the rules later." You almost smile. Even centuries ago, necessity was a persuasive negotiator. You watch quality standards bend, not break. Goods still need to sell, reputation still matter, but perfection takes a back seat to completion. A slightly crooked shoe is better than no shoe at all. A light joke drifts through your thoughts as you imagine medieval customer service lines filled with, "Yes, it's a bit uneven, but so is everything right now." You notice how this flexibility opens doors. Skilled workers move between towns, carrying techniques and ideas with them. Knowledge travels faster when fewer people are guarding it. Mainstream accounts suggest this contributes to long-term economic dynamism. Though no one at the time uses that phrase, you just feel the buzz of possibility humming beneath the dust. There's tension, of course. Older masters grumble about declining standards and lost prestige. Younger workers shrug and take the opportunity. Authority inside guilds becomes negotiable, especially when enforcement depends on people who are already stretched thin. Historians still argue whether this moment planted early seeds of a freer labor market, but the ground definitely loosens. As evening settles over the workshop, shutters close on a day that would have been impossible before the plague. You sense that skill, once trapped behind walls of tradition, is slipping through cracks widened by absence. And as you rest, that quiet loosening of rules, of paths, of futures, settles into you, carrying you gently towards sleep. You start noticing it in the margins first, because that's where change usually waits until it's ready. A woman running a stall a little too confidently. Another signing a contract instead of standing silently beside it. These aren't announcements, they're adjustments. After the plague, absence opens space, and women step into it. Not everywhere, not without resistance, but often enough that you feel the pattern forming. You pass a workshop where the master's name hasn't changed, but the voice giving instructions has. A widow now oversees production, her authority practical rather than ceremonial. Mainstream historians agree that the Black Death creates new economic opportunities for women, particularly widows, who inherit businesses, land and tools when male relatives die. From your perspective, it doesn't feel revolutionary. It feels necessary. You watch women take on roles as brewers, traders, textile producers, and shopkeepers. Jobs they'd done informally before, now done openly. Brewing, in particular, becomes a lifeline. A quirky tidbit surfaces in many towns. Alewives, female brewers, are so common that authorities later try to restrict them, not for quality but for competition. You imagine the irritation behind those rules and almost admire the audacity. Legal documents change tone, too. You see women named directly in contracts instead of referenced through husbands or fathers. Not everywhere, not always, but often enough to matter. Historians still argue whether this represents genuine empowerment or a temporary loophole created by demographic disaster. But standing here, the autonomy feels real to the people living it. You notice the social tension this creates. Some men resent it quietly. Others are relieved someone competent is handling things. Survival lowers the bar for ideology. If someone can keep the roof from collapsing and the books balanced, arguments about proper roles suddenly feel less urgent. A light joke flickers through your thoughts as you imagine medieval debates ending with, "Yes, but she actually shows up." There's grief underneath all of this. Many of these women didn't seek independence. It arrived with loss. You feel that weight in the way conversations soften when names are mentioned, in how authority is carried without swagger. Mainstream accounts note that remarriage rates among widows are high, but not universal. Some choose not to remarry, valuing control over security. That choice alone marks a shift. Education plays a role here too. Literacy, once a luxury, becomes practical. You see women learning to read accounts, mark inventories, sign names. Historians still argue how widespread female literacy became in this period, but you see enough chalk dust and ink stains to know it's growing. As night comes, you reflect on how these changes don't shout. They hum. They persist quietly, reshaping daily life without asking permission. The world after the plague isn't equal, but it's altered. And as you drift towards sleep, you sense that once women step forward and are seen, even briefly, the memory of that visibility doesn't entirely fade. You wander past churches that survived the plague and notice the air feels heavier, not with incense, but with questions. Faith hasn't disappeared, but it wobbles in ways you can feel. People murmur prayers with careful voices, almost testing whether God is listening this time. Mainstream historians agree that the Black Death shakes religious certainty. People pray, light candles, and still watch friends vanish. The pattern is clear, belief persists, but doubt threads through it like a stubborn shadow. You hear confessions that are longer than usual, almost as if people are negotiating the terms of their own survival. Why was I spared? Why did my neighbor die? You sense the anxiety beneath ritual. Church attendance remains high, but the motivations are layered: hope, guilt, curiosity, even fear. Historians still argue whether this period marks a genuine shift in theological understanding or simply a more intense ritualistic practice. But standing here, the uncertainty is palpable. A quirky detail floats into your awareness. Some communities develop local saints or miracle stories almost immediately, attributing survival to small, tangible interventions, throwing a bit of holy water over a doorway or keeping a blessed chicken nearby. It's practical magic with a religious twist, a fascinating blend of devotion and improvisation that makes you wonder how much people rely on stories to survive emotionally. You notice the effect on clergy too. Many priests died during the plague, and replacements are often hurriedly trained or borrowed from other parishes. You overhear villagers whisper about half-prepared priests and wonder if the sermons matter more than the listener realizes. Mainstream accounts confirm clergy shortages across Europe, leading to scandals, uneven performance, and sometimes outright disbelief. It's not universal, but enough to change how people perceive authority. Pilgrimages rise and fall unpredictably. Some believe traveling to holy sites will prevent further death. Others stay home, Suspicious of crowds, knowing contagion lingers, you pass travelers on the road carrying tiny relics, their faces tight with hope and exhaustion. Historians still argue whether pilgrimage patterns post-plague reflect genuine faith or a desperate search for control in an unpredictable world. You notice how doubt mingles with resilience. Churches are still central, bells still toll, but people are quietly negotiating belief for themselves. A light joke drifts through your thoughts as you imagine parishioners secretly rating sermons for efficiency. Nunneries 10 would absolve again. Children are taught prayers with a cautionary tone, almost like instruction manuals for survival. Adults balance reverence with skepticism. The spiritual landscape feels like a careful negotiation rather than a blind leap. Mainstream historians observe that this blend of faith and doubt influences art, literature, and civic behavior for decades to come. By evening, candles flicker in half-filled pews. The quiet chatter, the softened rituals, the subtle questioning, all of it hums around you like a gentle undercurrent. You realize that belief hasn't ended. It has transformed, becoming both fragile and stubborn, like survivors themselves. And as you settle into rest, that soft, uncertain faith drifts into your dreams with a weight that feels oddly comforting. You wander closer to the churches again, but this time your attention shifts to the people inside, not the architecture. Clergy are thinner on the ground, and those remaining move with a mixture of exhaustion and authority. You overhear parishioners gossiping, quietly, carefully, about who's truly holy and who's just keeping the lights on. Mainstream historians note that the Black Death leaves Europe with a severe shortage of priests, monks, and nuns, creating both spiritual gaps and opportunities for scandal. From your perspective, you feel it as tension hanging in the air like incense smoke. You notice hurriedly ordained priests trying to keep up. They read prayers from hastily copied manuscripts, sometimes forgetting lines or blending rituals together. People whisper, not to mock, but because mistakes feel more significant than before. Historians still argue whether these shortages permanently undermined clerical authority or merely created a temporary wobble. But you can see the fragility clearly. A quirky tidbit drifts by. Some villages reportedly keep a rolling priest, a clergyman who moves between parishes on a fixed schedule, trying to maintain services despite the shortage. It's like carpooling holiness. You can't help a small chuckle at the practicality, even if the stakes feel high. You feel the strain in confession lines, which are longer than usual, not necessarily in numbers but in complexity. People want to confess more because they survived and feel guilty, or because they want guidance in navigating a world where so many familiar structures have collapsed. Mainstream accounts highlight an uptick in penitential acts and indulgences, sometimes monetized, sometimes just desperate attempts at reassurance. Scandals surface quietly but persistently. A priest accused of abandoning a parish, or one rumored to have hoarded provisions, creates ripples of distrust. You see it in sideways glances, cautious conversation, and reluctant participation in rituals. Historians still argue whether these scandals represent systemic failure or the inevitable side effect of population collapse. But either way, the social fabric shows new stress lines. The absence of clergy forces communities to improvise. Laypeople conduct some rites, elders lead prayers, and some families maintain their own records of births, deaths, and marriages. It's not sanctioned, but it works. You notice how ordinary people gain agency in spiritual life, not because anyone asked them to, but because necessity demands it. A light joke drifts through your thoughts. DIY sacraments coming to a village near you. Education and literacy creep into this picture too. Reading prayers aloud requires skill, and you see young men and women learning rapidly. The need for literate laypeople grows alongside clergy shortages, subtly shifting the balance of authority. Historians still argue whether this literacy jump has long-term effects, but standing here, it feels like a quiet revolution unfolding page by page. By nightfall, you watch candles flicker in sparsely populated pews. The scent of wax and faint smoke mixes with the hum of whispered prayers. You sense that faith itself has adapted, not gone, not broken, but stretched thinner, flexible enough to survive. And as you lie down, you carry a quiet realization that belief, like everything else in this world, has found a way to persist amid loss and uncertainty. You step outside the church now and let the evening air carry your thoughts. Because the plague didn't only affect belief, it humbles every attempt at knowledge. Medicine, once confident in its theories, now feels like a student caught in a storm of its own making. Healers shrug more than they instruct. Herbs are boiled, bloodletting happens cautiously. Prayers for recovery mingle with experimental remedies. Mainstream historians agree that the Black Death exposes the limits of medieval medicine, shaking confidence in treatments and practitioners alike. You can sense that humility in the tense gestures of apothecaries and barber, surgeons alike. You notice the smell of boiling herbs mingling with the smoke from hearths. People experiment openly. Some try combinations of plants that were once forbidden. Others adopt dietary changes based on rumor or local superstition. Fringe practices emerge, some harmless, some odd. A quirky tidbit floats to the surface. In certain towns, people smear crocodile dung on the skin, believing it to be protective. You cringe slightly, laugh quietly, and remind yourself that desperate times invite desperate measures. Healers themselves speak differently now. They admit uncertainty where before they would have spoken with absolute authority. Historians still argue whether this period laid the groundwork for more empirical observation in European medicine, but for now, you feel the cautious curiosity in the air. Some healers begin taking careful notes, comparing what works to what fails, even if their methods are inconsistent or anecdotal. You walk past a small clinic where patients sit quietly, each aware that survival isn't guaranteed. A mother whispers to her child that the healer might help, might not. Mainstream accounts highlight that mortality remains high, and fear of recurrence colors every medical encounter. The atmosphere is thick with both hope and hesitation. You notice how communities adapt socially as well. Healers are now valued differently. Those who survive a plague wave gain prestige, sometimes blending ritual, practical care, and a reputation that borders on superstition. You see families paying in kind, grain, eggs, small favors, rather than formal fees, because trust and survival outweigh economic structure. Historians still argue whether these shifts permanently altered the relationship between patient and practitioner, but standing here, you feel the subtle recalibration. A light joke sneaks in as you imagine a medieval Yelp review. Healer was polite, vaguely accurate, definitely smelled like herbs. Would consult again if desperate. Laughter is quiet, respectful. You sense that humor, like medicine, is a survival mechanism. By nightfall, you pause by a candle-lit doorway, watching the small rituals of care, the scribbled notes, the cautious gestures. Medicine has learned humility, yes, but also resilience. It continues quietly observing, experimenting and adapting, and as sleep draws near, you carry a faint reassurance even human knowledge, flawed and fragile, survives when it bends instead of breaks. You drift past the streets and churches now, and find yourself drawn to the quiet corners where art is creeping back into life. Not grand cathedrals or royal commissions, those take decades to recover, but the small, domestic, everyday kinds of creativity, skulls carved into tableware, dancers mimicking death, murals in town halls. These images catch your eye in a way that's oddly cheerful, or at least wry. Mainstream historians agree that the post-Black Death era sparks a surge in memento mori imagery, a fascination with mortality expressed through paintings, carvings, and public spectacles. Standing here, you feel the humor, the reflection, the inevitability of it all. You notice townspeople using the arts to process loss, often with a sly grin hidden beneath the paint. Children play games that mimic grave digging or corpses walking. Adults whisper jokes about death during festivals. It's grotesque by modern standards, but also deeply human. A quirky tidbit surfaces: some communities stage Dance of Death performances in the marketplace, where skeletons literally lead the living in mock processions. You almost laugh imagining medieval TikTok trends featuring skeletal choreography. Art, here, is both therapeutic and political. You see painters exaggerating wealth and status even as populations shrink, subtly reminding survivors of social hierarchies that still exist. Yet the same artists include reminders that death spares no one. Historians still argue whether this shift in imagery reflects genuine philosophical reflection, coping mechanisms, or a bit of both. But to you, the point is clear: people are thinking about death differently. You wander into a small home where a carved wooden panel shows the Grim Reaper offering a hand to a merchant. Mainstream records indicate that artisans often include dark humor in private commissions for wealthy clients or civic spaces. These items aren't macabre for shock, they are reminders, warnings, and sometimes gentle mockery. You notice that even everyday objects, cups, plates, furniture, carry motifs that nod toward mortality. Children, you realize, learn about death not just through tragedy but through performance. Games, songs, and stories teach lessons while softening fear. Adults smile or wince, aware of both the playfulness and the lesson. You notice how humor and reflection mix here, creating a culture where mortality is both acknowledged and gently mocked. Historians still debate how much these cultural shifts influenced later Renaissance attitudes, but standing here, you sense continuity, curiosity, and survival. A light joke flicks through your thoughts as you watch a sculptor carve a skeleton juggling coins. Death may be inevitable, but taxes? That's just tragicomic. You chuckle quietly, grateful for levity in a world rebuilt on absence and shadow. As night falls, you trace your fingers along carved motifs, letting the tactile reminders of mortality and resilience ease into your mind. Art, like the rest of life after the Black Death, doesn't shy away from reality. It interprets, questions, and sometimes jokes about it. And as you drift into sleep, that mixture of reflection, humor, and persistence hums softly, settling around you like a familiar blanket. You follow the smell now because it's impossible to ignore. Bread baking, stew simmering, smoke curling from chimneys. All of it tastes richer when fewer mouths are around to divide it. Food itself becomes a statement, a quiet celebration of survival. Mainstream historians note that average diets improve after the Black Death: more meat, more dairy, more calories per person. You feel it in your own stomach, an undeniable comfort in the aftermath of absence. You walk through a market where produce is piled higher than you expect. Fewer people mean less competition, and suddenly small luxuries. A slice of cheese, a hunk of meat, aren't just for the elite. You sense that this abundance, however uneven, is almost intoxicating. Fringe tidbits drift through your mind. Some communities experiment with new recipes or spices that arrived via trade routes previously ignored, curious to make the most of what they now have. Imagine medieval culinary innovation fueled by scarcity turned surplus. You notice how this affects social interaction. People eat more publicly, sometimes extravagantly by former standards, because food signals survival as much as sustenance. Hosts offer plates to neighbors, fostering tentative trust. Mainstream accounts confirm that feasts and communal meals rise in prominence, serving as both social glue and subtle displays of resilience. You see changes in agriculture too. With fewer workers, fields shift from labor-intensive crops like wheat to pastures for livestock, especially sheep and cattle. This isn't just efficiency, it's necessity and adaptation, blending survival and profit. Historians still argue whether this trend is temporary or helps kickstart longer-term shifts in European economies. But walking through these fields, the logic feels immediate. You overhear a family joking quietly about having more beef than problems, which makes you grin. Humor sneaks in alongside sustenance, because laughter is cheap and calories are now abundant enough to allow for it. You feel the irony that death's devastation also makes indulgence possible. strange, bitter, and oddly satisfying all at once. Storage and preservation also change. Salted meat, smoked fish, and dried grains become essentials not just for survival but for trade. You sense a cautious pride in households that manage supplies well, understanding that planning and patience now pay off in ways invisible before. A light joke drifts through your thoughts as you imagine someone hoarding spices and thinking, "I am the envy of 5 villages and 1 suspicious cat." Children notice this too. Smaller households mean more food per mouth, more meat at meals, and sometimes a treat here and there. You hear the excitement in their voices, tempered with the lingering fear of scarcity. Mainstream historians point out that these dietary improvements contribute to health and longevity for survivors, though they remain uneven and fragile. By evening, the aroma of cooked food lingers across towns and villages alike. You pause, inhale, and let it settle over you like warmth from a fire. The world after the Black Death isn't perfect. It's quieter, slower, and oddly richer in ways that weren't possible before. And as you lie down, savoring the lingering taste of survival and subtle abundance, you drift towards sleep feeling both nourished and cautiously hopeful. You sense a low hum of tension in the countryside, subtle but persistent, like a thread pulled tight across fields and villages. Rebellions simmer beneath the surface. The scarcity of labor and rising wages give peasants confidence, and some are willing to test the boundaries. Mainstream historians agree that post-Black Death Europe sees a notable increase in uprisings, most famously the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. Though unrest occurs across the continent, you can feel it in glances exchanged over fences, in whispered complaints at market stalls, in the way young men walk a little straighter than before. You wander into a small village meeting where elders discuss rising rents and feudal obligations. Voices are low but firm. Farmers argue for fairer treatment. Officials mutter about discipline and order. The air is thick with barely contained frustration. Historians still argue whether these revolts are primarily economic, social, or a blend of both. But standing here, the pressure feels tangible, almost electric. A quirky tidbit drifts through your thoughts in some cases. Rebels carry banners painted with skeletons or funny slogans mocking local lords. Humor, you notice, is always a weapon, sometimes sharper than a sword. You can't help but smile at the audacity. Death itself becomes a prop for protest. You see how governments respond. Threats, fines, and occasional violence are deployed to suppress dissent, but the effectiveness varies. Where enforcement is weak, revolts spread quickly. Where armies intervene, fear temporarily returns, but only as a pause, not a permanent solution. Mainstream accounts note that authorities struggle to assert control over a population that now knows its own leverage. You walk along a dirt path and overhear 2 peasants discussing the old ways. They don't want to return to complete subservience, but they also recognize the danger in pushing too far. Power is shifting, but not yet fully in their hands. Historians still debate whether these uprisings represent genuine early steps towards social mobility or mere reactions to immediate conditions. But to you, the strategy and calculation in these discussions are obvious. Small victories ripple outward. Lords make concessions on labor, rents, or access to resources to quell unrest. You notice how local compromise becomes a survival strategy for both peasants and elites. The negotiations are messy and uneven. A light joke flickers through your thoughts as you imagine a squire whispering to a lord, "Yes, sir. We'll pretend the cows belong to you. For now." Children and apprentices watch quietly, learning from these subtle power shifts. Revolts aren't just dramatic. They're lessons in agency, strategy, and timing. Even if nothing is written down, these small insurgencies teach the community its own value in practical terms. As night falls over the village, the tension doesn't vanish. It softens into a quiet readiness. People sleep, knowing the world has changed, and that even quiet defiance carries weight. And as you drift towards sleep yourself, you carry the hum of possibility. of careful negotiation, and the memory that even in absence, courage persists. You feel the subtle pulse of trade now, because after upheaval, the economy doesn't collapse, it recalibrates. Roads once crowded with wagons now hold fewer carts but heavier loads. Merchants carry goods farther, negotiate harder, and measure risk more carefully. Mainstream historians note that trade networks, both local and international, adjust significantly after the Black Death. From your perspective, the change is palpable. Routes that were previously predictable now twist, stretch, and flex around empty towns and newly populated hubs. You notice the rhythm of market days has changed. Crowds are smaller but more purposeful. Conversations are measured, buyers ask more questions, sellers respond cautiously, and the cost of misjudgment is immediate. Fringe tidbits emerge too. Some traders experiment with bartering exotic spices for basic commodities, a quirky swap that would have been laughed at pre-plague. You almost chuckle at the medieval equivalent of trading your vintage book for a pack of raiment. City guilds play a bigger role here than ever. Artisans and merchants band together, enforcing quality standards, controlling access to resources, and sometimes manipulating prices to maintain influence. Mainstream accounts highlight that guilds expand in power post-plague, in part to stabilize trade disrupted by population loss. You notice the subtle tension. While guilds protect their own, they also create opportunities for outsiders skilled or daring enough to join. You pass a dock where ships unload cargo from across the continent. Fewer sailors are available, so voyages are riskier, slower, but also more valuable. Ships carry wool, salt, grain, and coins in careful balance. Historians still argue whether this scarcity drives innovation in shipbuilding and navigation, but you sense the ingenuity in the air. Ropes repaired on the fly, sails patched with whatever fabric is at hand. Travelers talk about distant markets with awe, spreading information about prices, shortages, and opportunities. You realize knowledge itself has become a commodity. The act of knowing where to sell grain or wool, or even who survived in a neighboring town, carries power. A light joke drifts through your mind as you imagine a medieval WhatsApp of merchants passing gossip faster than armies. You notice laborers migrating between towns, following opportunities like bees to flowers. Their movement keeps markets alive, ensures production, and subtly shifts bargaining power. Mainstream historians emphasize that mobility after the Black Death strengthens economic resilience while simultaneously undermining traditional hierarchies. Standing here, you feel the effect immediately. People, resources, and information all flow differently than before. Even the mundane exchanges matter. Coins are counted more carefully, weights checked, promises weighed before spoken. You overhear a small debate over a shipment of cloth, each party calculating survival, profit, and risk. Historians still argue whether these micro-adjustments create long-term financial literacy among common folk, but to you, they feel like tiny revolutions happening in real time. By evening, lanterns flicker along streets and wharves. You hear the clink of coin, the murmur of deals, the quiet satisfaction of survival leveraged into advantage. Trade, once predictable and rigid, now bends and adapts around absence, and as you settle to rest, you carry a sense of rhythm, the pulse of commerce that refuses to die, even when much else has. You wander into the countryside again, because even as cities hum with trade, the countryside carries a quieter kind of transformation. Fences, once precise and unyielding, are now loosely maintained. Crops are rotated differently, fields left fallow, and livestock roam with more freedom. Mainstream historians note that the Black Death prompts long-term changes in land use, from grain-dominated fields to pastures for sheep and cattle, partly because fewer laborers make intensive cultivation difficult. You feel the logic in every overgrown furrow, every wandering animal. You notice villagers experimenting with new techniques, improvising tools, and testing unfamiliar crops. Necessity pushes innovation in ways that tradition had resisted. A quirky tidbit floats through your mind. Some farmers sprinkle human ashes or plague soil in gardens, thinking it encourages growth. A mixture of superstition and practicality that seems both grim and oddly clever. You smile faintly at the medieval combination of science and ritual. Labor scarcity affects social structure too. You watch middle-aged men and women taking on work once reserved for younger laborers. Elders supervise more actively. Children assume responsibilities earlier. Historians still argue whether this demographic reshuffling strengthens social cohesion or just intensifies stress. But standing in the fields, you sense the practical necessity. Communities also rethink obligations. Villagers negotiate access to shared resources, mills, wells, communal pastures, with more flexibility than ever before. You overhear someone say, "We do what's fair today, and tomorrow we see." A statement that carries both pragmatism and a tiny revolution in local governance. Mainstream accounts note that informal agreements often supersede feudal law during this period, even if temporarily. You notice diet and farming intersect. Households raise more animals for meat and dairy, balancing immediate need with long-term survival. Small orchards are cultivated carefully, and herbs once ignored are now valued for flavor, medicine, and ritual. You feel the rhythm of life changing: work, harvest, barter, cook, repeat, but with a sharper awareness of scarcity and opportunity. A light joke drifts into your thoughts. A farmer explains crop rotation to a neighbor as if giving a lecture on quantum physics. "You may not understand it fully," he says, "but the weeds will." The humor softens the weight of adaptation. You see evidence of mobility too. Families move to better soil, laborers to more generous lords, apprentices to workshops where wages are higher. Migration, once dangerous and socially frowned upon, becomes a tool of survival. Historians still argue whether these shifts permanently alter rural economies or simply provide temporary relief, but the effect on everyday life is unmistakable. As the sun sets over tilled fields and pastures, you sense the countryside learning resilience. Patterns emerge not from decree but from adaptation, not from certainty but from improvisation. And as you lie down to rest, you carry the quiet pulse of a world bending to survive, finding its own rhythm after chaos. You walk along the village edges now and notice the faint hum of rebuilding, not just houses, but relationships. Survivors have fewer neighbors, and every interaction carries weight. Gossip spreads faster because each voice matters more. Mainstream historians note that social networks shrink after massive mortality events, making each connection more significant. You sense it immediately: every nod, every handshake, every exchange of food or advice feels like a small contract of survival. You see neighbors visiting each other with purpose. Invitations are deliberate. Assistance is noticed. Small gestures carry disproportionate importance. A quirky tidbit drifts by in some villages. People leave a token on doorsteps, perhaps a bit of bread or a carved figurine, to signal trustworthiness, almost like a medieval friend request. You smile at the simplicity and subtlety of it. Marriage patterns shift too. Fewer eligible partners mean families negotiate differently, sometimes relaxing old restrictions. You overhear a negotiation about a bride's dowry where the usual pomp is replaced by pragmatic discussion: land, livestock, and labor, rather than long-standing tradition. Historians still argue whether these demographic pressures permanently altered marriage customs, but standing there, you see change in real time. Communal events take on new meaning. Weddings, markets, festivals. They're not just for celebration but for reaffirming who's alive, who belongs, and who will help maintain social structure. You sense the mixture of joy and anxiety. Mainstream accounts note a resurgence in community rituals post-plague, blending continuity with improvisation. Trust is fragile but more deliberate. You notice people evaluating newcomers carefully, offering small tests of reliability. Contracts are verbal, written, or symbolic. Historians still argue whether this increased scrutiny strengthens social cohesion or breeds subtle resentment. But for now, it clearly regulates interaction. You notice humor creeping back into social life, a light counterbalance to grief. Jokes, parodies of old hierarchies, and playful mockery of tradition appear in gatherings. A light joke drifts through your thoughts. Someone imitates the lord of the manor bowing to peasants, and the crowd chuckles quietly, careful not to overstep. Humor is a form of calibration, a way to test limits without breaking them. Children participate differently too. They are fewer, but each child carries more responsibility and more attention. Games are quieter, reflective, sometimes mimicking adult roles, teaching lessons about survival, negotiation, and hierarchy. You notice how observation and mimicry become a subtle social education. By nightfall, you pause along a path leading back to the village. Lights glow faintly through windows. Voices hum softly from homes. You feel the fragile, deliberate web of human connection taking shape again. And as sleep pulls at your eyelids, you carry the sense that community itself is learning to adapt, weaving together absence, resilience, and trust in ways both visible and invisible. You wander toward the outskirts of town now, where trade, survival, and rumor intersect. Markets are quieter than before, but the people who remain are sharper, quicker, and more deliberate. Every negotiation feels like a game of chess. Every misstep has consequences that ripple farther than they used to. Mainstream historians note that post-Black Death economies are marked by careful, sometimes cautious, decision-making as communities adapt to scarcity. You sense it in the way merchants weigh coins and words equally. You overhear a craftsman bargaining for wool, carefully calculating how many yards he can trade for grain. Each coin carries more weight because labor is scarce and materials are valuable. Fringe tidbits drift by, some traders resort to unusual exchanges, bartering household goods or favors instead of money, a kind of improvised microeconomy that surprises everyone involved. You grin at the creativity born from necessity. Guilds and local authorities are watching too. They can't afford mistakes or empty hands. Apprentices are trained faster, rules are bent subtly to keep production alive. Mainstream accounts confirm that guilds loosen some restrictions to cope with labor shortages, though they remain hierarchical. You see the tension rules exist, but survival trumps rigidity. You notice travelers moving cautiously along roads, carrying news, goods, and rumors from town to town. Knowledge itself is a currency. A light joke drifts through your thoughts. A merchant mutters, "I'll trade secrets for cheese." And you imagine medieval espionage running on dairy. Yet the practicality is real. Information about shortages, prices, and surviving communities shapes decisions daily. Laborers are mobile like never before. Peasants leave lords offering poor wages or harsh obligations, seeking towns or estates with better conditions. Mainstream historians note that this mobility contributes to rising wages and the weakening of traditional feudal structures. You feel the subtle shift in power. Scarcity empowers movement, and movement empowers choice. Daily life has a rhythm all its own. Homes are quieter, streets less crowded, but the hum of activity is focused. Every action, planting, trading, negotiating, feels intentional. Historians still argue whether this period represents permanent economic restructuring or temporary adaptation, but for you, the results are tangible. Communities become experimental laboratories. People test rules, social expectations, and labor arrangements in small, careful increments. You overhear someone noting, "We'll see if he enforces that law today." And it strikes you how much human behavior has become an adaptive strategy rather than mere tradition. By evening, you watch lanterns flare in the distance. You sense the rhythm of society adjusting to loss, deliberate, cautious, inventive. And as night descends, you feel the quiet pulse of resilience in every step along the cobbled streets and dirt paths, a steady heartbeat that carries communities forward after unimaginable absence. You notice it in the smallest details now. The tools left out overnight, repaired fences, patched roofs. Survivors care more for what remains than they ever did for abundance. Every nail, every piece of timber, Every ounce of grain carries a weight that wasn't present before. Mainstream historians emphasize that material scarcity after the Black Death fosters not only thrift, but innovation. People reuse, repair, and improvise in ways that feel both practical and almost artistic. You feel it in your fingertips as you trace the grooves of a well-worn plow handle. You walk past a house where a family repairs a roof with whatever they can scavenge: broken tiles, old boards, moss, and they laugh quietly at the absurdity. A quirky tidbit drifts through your mind. In some villages, broken pottery is crushed and used as filler for walls, a crude but surprisingly effective form of recycling. You chuckle at the practicality and imagination of it, realizing that necessity breeds cleverness you wouldn't expect. Labor is precious here. Fewer hands mean every task is valued, every skill recognized. Apprenticeship is accelerated, neighbors swap favors for help, and shared labor becomes a subtle form of currency. Mainstream accounts note that communities develop informal agreements and flexible labor systems to cope with population loss, though enforcement is inconsistent. Historians still argue whether these practices have long-term effects on labor relations, but you see their immediate impact in efficiency and cooperation. You notice children participating more actively in work, not because they're forced, but because survival requires every pair of hands. Tasks are simplified, divided and rotated. Learning is hands-on, pragmatic and sometimes playful. A light joke flits through your thoughts. A child complains that carrying a basket is harder than carrying a crown, and you smile at the innocent perspective. Innovation is everywhere. Farmers experiment with crop rotations, townspeople improvise repairs, and artisans combine techniques to overcome shortages. Even small inventions, like improved hinges, simple pulleys, or stronger mortar mixes, spread quickly because the margin for error is thinner. Mainstream historians agree that these incremental improvements contribute to broader technological development, though they rarely appear in grand chronicles. Social hierarchy is subtly shifting too. Lording families recognize that cooperation yields more than coercion, if only temporarily. Negotiations over wages, rents, and obligations are increasingly pragmatic rather than purely traditional. Historians still debate whether these shifts presage a permanent decline in feudal authority, but the practical evidence surrounds you: agreements, compromises, and small victories for the less powerful. By night, the quiet hum of repaired and adapted homes surrounds you. You sense a world learning from absence, improvising, and surviving with ingenuity. As you settle into sleep, the tools, the patched roofs, and the small acts of cleverness feel like a lullaby, a testament to human resilience quietly shaping the world. You follow the distant sound of hammering and cart wheels, because even amid survival, commerce has returned with cautious energy. Streets are quieter, but the rhythm of trade is precise and deliberate. Mainstream historians note that post-Black Death, local and regional trade rebounds faster than population alone might suggest, fueled by necessity, opportunity, and innovation. From where you stand, every transaction feels deliberate, almost ceremonial, a negotiation of survival wrapped in daily routine. You notice that artisans who survived the plague are in higher demand. Their skills are scarce and their labor is valued more than ever. A quirky tidbit drifts in. Some blacksmiths and shoemakers are rumored to be paid partly in goods, partly in favors, and partly in minor privileges like access to better firewood. You imagine a medieval barter economy with just a hint of absurdity, and you grin quietly. Guilds remain a stabilizing force, though their authority is stretched thin. Apprentices are trained faster, restrictions are loosened, and rules are enforced selectively. Mainstream accounts confirm that guilds navigate a delicate balance, protect quality while keeping production alive. Historians still argue whether this flexibility represents the beginning of modern labor negotiation or a temporary adjustment. But walking among the workshops, you feel the tangible effects of adaptation. Markets hum with cautious optimism. Traders share information about distant towns, prices, and labor availability. Knowledge itself is currency, sometimes more valuable than goods. A light joke drifts through your mind. A merchant whispers, "I'd trade your secret for a loaf of bread," and you laugh softly at the timeless appeal of gossip as leverage. Labor mobility remains a defining feature. Peasants and skilled workers alike move where conditions are favorable, subtly shifting the balance of power. Lords and merchants who adapt find success. Those who resist struggle to enforce old rules. Mainstream historians emphasize that this mobility strengthens bargaining positions for laborers and challenges traditional hierarchies. You notice subtle innovations in logistics. Wagons are repaired and optimized, storage techniques improve, and trade routes are mapped with increasing precision. Even small improvements, better barrels, safer crossings, or faster communication, amplify the efficiency of commerce. Historians still debate whether these changes catalyze larger economic transformations, but in real time, the effect is immediate and practical. By evening, lanterns glow in workshops and market stalls, echoing with the quiet rhythm of adaptation and exchange. You feel the pulse of recovery, fragile, deliberate, and persistent. As you settle down to rest, the hum of trade, movement, and ingenuity lulls you into sleep, a reminder that survival is both a necessity and an ongoing act of creativity. You walk into the villages and towns now with a keen sense of law and order, or the lack of it. Authorities are still trying to assert control, but their power is uneven, fragile, and sometimes downright performative. Mainstream historians agree that post-Black Death Europe sees shifts in legal enforcement, fewer officials, inconsistent punishments, and greater reliance on local custom. From where you stand, law feels more like a guideline than an immutable force, bending to survival and opportunity. You overhear a local constable muttering as he measures fines for minor infractions. The numbers fluctuate, adjusted for necessity or fear of rebellion. Fringe tidbits surface in some areas. Fines are cleverly negotiated in livestock, barrels of grain, or even labor hours, rather than coins. You can't help a quiet laugh imagining someone paying their tax with a basket of eggs, and the constable shaking his head but accepting anyway. Peasant unrest, previously restrained, now interacts with the law in unpredictable ways. You notice villagers challenging unfair rules, negotiating labor obligations, and sometimes openly ignoring decrees they deem unreasonable. Mainstream accounts confirm increased disputes over wages, rents, and labor services during this period. Historians still debate whether these disputes represent temporary opportunism or the early beginnings of a more assertive legal consciousness among the lower classes. But you see the effect everywhere you look. Courtrooms, when they convene, feel strange, half empty, half tense, filled with the echo of authority weakened by demographic collapse. Officials rely on local consensus to enforce decisions, sometimes deferring to village elders or respected craftsmen. You sense the subtle power shift. Legality is no longer absolute, it's negotiable, adaptive, and context-dependent. A quirky detail drifts through your mind. Some villages reportedly hold mock trials for entertainment or social instruction, blending humor and legal practice. It's a way to test authority without risking serious conflict. You imagine medieval stand-up comedy meets civic duty, and it makes you grin. Even private agreements carry more weight than formal law. You notice families drafting written contracts to clarify labor, marriage, or tenancy arrangements. Mainstream historians emphasize that these practices increase after the Black Death, as people rely more on personal accountability than distant authority. You feel the subtle empowerment in these small documents, proof that adaptation isn't just physical or economic, it's also legal and social. As night falls, the village streets are quiet but charged with a new understanding. Rules exist, but power is fluid, survival trumps ritual, and negotiation has replaced unquestioned obedience. You lie down with the faint hum of authority bending around necessity, a soft reassurance that even law can flex without breaking entirely. You drift toward the cultural edges of towns now, because after the Black Death, people don't just rebuild structures, they rebuild meaning. Music, storytelling, and performance return, sometimes in surprisingly inventive ways. Mainstream historians note a rise in secular entertainment alongside traditional religious observances, reflecting both population shifts and a collective desire to reclaim life. Standing here, you feel it in the streets: laughter, song, and movement weaving through the cautious rhythm of survival. You notice children mimicking dances they saw adults perform, while adults watch quietly, laughing or correcting steps. It's both play and rehearsal, practice for a world where social cohesion matters as much as survival. Fringe tidbits drift in. In some villages, performers use plague masks in plays, exaggerating skeletal features to comic or cautionary effect. You chuckle at the creativity, the absurdity of death turned into entertainment, while sensing its deeper emotional function. Artisans and musicians who survived are suddenly in high demand. Their scarcity makes talent more valuable, and guilds or local authorities sometimes sponsor performances to keep spirits high and reinforce communal identity. Mainstream accounts highlight that this cultural revival contributes to social stability, providing ritual, humor, and reflection in equal measure. You overhear a storyteller weaving tales that blend tragedy, humor, and moral lessons. Survivors listen intently, nodding at references to absent neighbors and imagined heroes. Historians still argue whether these stories are genuine coping mechanisms, entertainment, or subtle social instruction, but the effect is clear: culture becomes a means of processing loss and imagining survival. You notice improvisation everywhere. Instruments are repaired with whatever material is at hand. Plays are adapted for smaller audiences. Songs mix old lyrics with new experiences. A light joke drifts through your thoughts. A fiddler replaces a missing string with fishing line and proclaims, "Music survives anything, even my incompetence." You smile, recognizing resilience woven into humor. Festivals and communal events return cautiously, sometimes altered to reflect demographic changes. Mainstream historians observe that some rituals are compressed, relocated, or simplified to accommodate smaller populations. You see people balancing tradition with pragmatism, honoring memory, while embracing life. Authority structures sometimes sponsor these events, sometimes quietly allow them, and sometimes simply step aside. Children, apprentices, and newcomers absorb all this. Dance, music, story, a social education, skills, norms, and memory pass organically alongside entertainment. You notice how performance itself becomes a subtle rehearsal for cooperation, negotiation, and adaptation. As evening settles, music drifts along cobbled streets, blending with candlelight and murmured conversation. You feel the delicate pulse of a culture reasserting itself, flexible, adaptive, and quietly defiant in the face of absence. And as you lie down, that soft rhythm of laughter and melody lulls you towards sleep, carrying both memory and hope. You wander now into the political currents that swirl just beneath the surface of rebuilt towns and villages. Power is no longer as predictable as it once was. Lords and magistrates discover that authority, once assumed, must now be negotiated, maintained, and occasionally bargained for. Mainstream historians note that post-Black Death Europe experiences subtle but meaningful shifts in political structures, as scarcity and labor mobility empower previously marginalized groups. From where you stand, the tension hums quietly, like wind rattling shutters before a storm. You notice peasants speaking up in local councils, merchants asserting influence in town meetings, and clergy balancing spiritual authority against practical governance. Fringe tidbits emerge. Some communities appoint temporary officials or rotate leadership as a way to keep everyone invested and avoid resentment. You almost smile at the pragmatism, a medieval democracy, light, born from necessity. Conflict is still present, but it's strategic rather than constant. Rebellions and uprisings are tempered by negotiation and compromise. Mainstream accounts suggest that lords who adapt to new labor conditions, wages, and mobility tend to retain loyalty, while those who cling rigidly to old hierarchies face unrest. Historians still argue whether these post-plague adjustments are precursors to more modern forms of governance. But standing here, you see the subtle shifts in action. Trade, taxation, and labor rights intersect with politics. You watch negotiations over market fees, labor obligations, and rents. Authority is enforced unevenly, and bargaining becomes a daily skill. A light joke flits through your mind. A clerk complains that his ledger has more arguments than numbers, and you quietly chuckle at the endless human calculus behind bureaucracy. Communication between communities takes on new importance. News travels faster because every connection matters more. Travelers, merchants, and clergy carry information that shapes decisions across towns and regions. Mainstream historians note that this period encourages informal networks of influence, as personal relationships become a key element of political stability. You notice subtle innovation in governance too. Charters are written more carefully, enforcement is measured, and informal agreements gain legitimacy. Even minor concessions, a delayed tax, a negotiated workweek, or recognition of labor rights, become tools to maintain social cohesion. Historians still debate how permanent these changes are, but the immediate effect is clear: survival drives political flexibility. As night falls, torches flicker across town halls and meeting places. You feel the quiet hum of negotiation, strategy, and adaptation weaving through civic life. Authority is no longer absolute, it is earned, maintained, and sometimes challenged, often with humor or pragmatism. And as you settle into rest, you carry the awareness that society itself, like the people within it, has learned to bend and endure, softly pulsing with resilience. You wander into the broader horizon now, because the effects of the Black Death aren't confined to individual villages or cities. They ripple outward across kingdoms, regions, and even continents. The world feels larger, emptier, yet strangely more connected. Trade routes, diplomacy, and migration have all shifted, subtly but irrevocably. Mainstream historians emphasize that post-plague Europe experiences long-term social, economic, and political restructuring, creating conditions for the Renaissance, exploration, and new forms of governance. Standing here, you feel the scope of change stretching beyond any single street or market. You notice that knowledge, labor, and opportunity no longer flow strictly along old hierarchies. Merchants cross borders, artisans relocate to growing cities, and scholars find themselves sought after in new courts. Fringe tidbits drift through your mind. Some towns adopt bizarre local rituals to attract settlers or skilled workers, from public feasts to quirky symbols painted on city gates. You chuckle quietly at the ingenuity, recognizing the human impulse to adapt and advertise in equal measure. Population shifts are dramatic yet uneven. Some areas are abandoned entirely, while others swell as survivors relocate. Mainstream accounts confirm that migration patterns fundamentally alter settlement geography, trade networks, and labor distribution. Historians still argue how lasting these changes are, but from your perspective, every empty road and crowded village tells a story of adaptation, ambition, and survival. Cultural exchange accelerates as well. Survivors traveling between regions carry not just goods, but ideas, techniques, and stories. Music, architecture, and culinary habits spread along the same veins as commerce. A light joke drifts through your thoughts. Imagine a wandering musician teaching a noble family a jig while simultaneously inventing a new recipe for bread. Innovation, humor, and necessity intertwine seamlessly. Political structures respond unevenly. Kings, lords, and councils adjust taxes, labor laws, and privileges in response to the altered demographic landscape. Negotiation and compromise become survival tools, not merely philosophical ideals. Mainstream historians note that the post-plague period subtly erodes rigid hierarchies while reinforcing networks of influence and practical governance. You see the intricate dance authority is maintained, but only through adaptability. Social life thrives in quiet, persistent ways. Communities reconstruct themselves around labor, resources, and trust. Education, religion, and trade all adapt to the changed population. Humor, ritual, and ingenuity punctuate survival, blending sorrow with resilience. Fringe anecdotes, like plague-inspired festivals, improvised remedies, or skeletal art, remind you that creativity often blooms in adversity. As night deepens, you sense the world breathing differently. Absence has forced reinvention. Scarcity has bred ingenuity. Life has returned, altered but persistent, stronger in adaptability than ever before. And as you settle into sleep, the gentle rhythms of trade, work, ritual, and laughter carry you toward rest, leaving the knowledge that humanity, after loss, learns, bends, and quietly thrives. Now, as you lie back, let your thoughts drift slowly over the contours of this transformed world. Imagine the soft flicker of lantern light across empty streets, the gentle clatter of tools in half-rebuilt workshops, the quiet laughter of children rediscovering games once forgotten. The plague took so much, yet in the spaces it left behind, something new began to grow. Not sudden, not triumphant, but gradual and resilient. You feel it in the hush of fields tilled by careful hands, in the rhythm of markets slowly pulsing with trade, in communities negotiating both survival and hope. Breathe in the textures of daily life, the smell of fresh bread mingling with smoke from repaired chimneys, the sound of cautious footsteps on cobblestones, the sight of skeletal motifs dancing quietly in murals and carvings. Life persists, adapts, and sometimes surprises, even in the aftermath of unimaginable loss. People improvise, joke, and create. They negotiate, experiment, and survive. Authority bends, labor moves, families adapt, and culture, subtle and persistent, continues to hum along the margins. As your body relaxes, let your mind ease into the quiet knowledge that change is not just inevitable, it is survivable. Absence leaves room for innovation, scarcity fosters creativity, grief teaches adaptability. Even when certainty has vanished, the human impulse to rebuild, to laugh softly in the shadow of mortality, and to care for one another carries forward. Let that rhythm, slow and steady, wrap around you, a gentle lullaby of persistence and hope. And as the soft hum of this world fades into silence, allow yourself to drift fully, cradled by the enduring, adaptive heartbeat of humanity. Absence is met with resilience, and life, in its quiet brilliance, goes on.